imagine. A queen ruling an entire kingdom whose life was a series of unbelievable tragedies as a mother. She was pregnant 17 times in 17 years, but only one of her children survived past the age of 2. Illness tormented her, causing her health to decline and her body to waste away, to the point where her legs were almost always terribly bandaged. And when she died, her coffin required 14 men to carry it. Even her closest confidants betrayed her, and there's a little-told story about her true gender identity, or perhaps a scandalous accusation about her relationships. Could a life filled with such immense loss truly be considered great? Queen Anne, a name synonymous with the birth of modern Great Britain, but when she first cried out in 1665, no one in England thought she would ever be queen. She was the 4th child and 2nd daughter of James, Duke of York, the king's brother. Her position in the line of succession was initially only 4th. It was as if she was an extra person in the brutal race for the throne. But then the Game of Thrones proved to be cruelly fleeting. Life in the 17th century was inherently fragile, and Anne witnessed her siblings die one by one. Her parents had 8 children, but ultimately only the 2 sisters, Anne and Mary, survived to adulthood. Tragedy struck early. When Anne was just 6 years old, her mother, Anne Hyde, died of cancer. Anne and her older sister had to live away from their father in Richmond, while he was busy with state affairs. It was a time of loneliness and isolation. Imagine a young girl losing her mother, separated from her father, in a large, quiet palace. How would that shape her? During those isolated years, a companion appeared who became a crucial source of support. Sarah Jennings, later Sarah Churchill. Sarah was 5 years older than Anne, incredibly intelligent and fiercely ambitious. From the start, they were 2 extremes. Anne was described as simple, sickly, and shy, while Sarah was beautiful, charismatic, and full of ambition. This relationship would shape both of them in ways they could not have predicted. Later, Anne's father, James, caused a huge shock to all of England. First, he converted to Catholicism, a move seen by the majority of Anglican English as a betrayal of faith and a threat to the country's future. For Anglicans, this brought back horrifying memories of persecution under previous Catholic monarchs. Then, he remarried Mary of Modena, a younger and even more devout Catholic. This was the first and deepest source of tension in the already fragile relationship between Anne and her father. At the age of 18, Anne married Prince George of Denmark. Sources give slightly different pictures of this husband. Some describe George as lazy and a drunk. Meanwhile, other sources said that Anne and George cared for each other and were devoted throughout their relationship, even if there wasn't much spark. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Was he seen as lazy by ambitious courtiers, but a kind, steady presence for Anne privately? One thing was clear: Anne had no interest in sharing power with her husband. For her, power was her own, and perhaps George's devotion was what she needed more than a ruling partner. But it was here in her family life that Anne's real nightmare began. In the span of 17 years, Queen Anne was pregnant 17 times. Stop and think about that number. 17 times hope, 17 times preparation, 17 times pain. And the tragedy repeated itself cruelly. Most pregnancies ended in miscarriages, stillbirths, or children dying after only a few days or weeks. Only one single child survived past the age of 2. Look at the year 1687. It was a particularly horrific year. First, she miscarried. A few days later, her husband contracted smallpox and transmitted it to their 2 infant daughters. George eventually recovered, but the little girls were too small, too weak. Just days after the second miscarriage, Anne lost both her daughters. Their palace, the cockpit, which should have been a home, became a dark place, filled with grief. Anne and George wept together, sometimes uncontrollably, sometimes just sitting in agonizing silence. And yet she suffered another stillbirth before that year ended. Centuries later, medical researchers believe they have found the cause behind this horrific suffering. The most common hypothesis is that Anne suffered from Hughes syndrome, also known as antiphospholipid syndrome, or a similar autoimmune disease. This syndrome causes the blood to be stickier than normal. Sticky blood made it difficult for Anne to move later in life. but more horrifyingly, it made it almost impossible for blood to flow through the tiny blood vessels of a developing fetus. And here is the bittersweet aha moment for modern viewers. A common medicine today, aspirin, could have thinned Anne's blood and saved the lives of all her children. Imagine the simple, inexpensive medicine in your cabinet could have prevented decades of this queen's agony. Imagine Anne's pain, her despair, constantly losing her children. How could a mother endure 17 times the pain of losing a child? This wasn't just personal tragedy, but also enormous pressure for the future of the fragile Tudor dynasty. In 1688, while Anne was still struggling with the pain of losing her children, a major political event occurred that directly threatened her position in the line of succession. Her stepmother, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart. For Anne and her sister Mary, this was a disaster. It not only pushed them back in the line of succession, but worse, it ensured that the heir to the throne would be a Catholic, endangering the future of Anglicanism in England. Just 5 months later, the Anglican reaction exploded. William of Orange, a Protestant and the husband of Anne's sister Mary, invaded England in what is known as the Glorious Revolution. The Anglicans, already fed up with the Catholic King James II, welcomed William and Mary with open arms, and this was one of the most bitter moments of betrayal in royal family history. Anne, her husband George, and the Churchill family, pushed by Sarah, sided with William and Mary, overthrowing her own father. King James II suffered the ultimate humiliation of being deposed by his own daughters and son-in-law. When he heard that Anne and Sarah had fled the palace to join William, he cried out a phrase full of pain. "God help me, even my children have forsaken me." Suddenly, William and Mary became king and queen, and Anne was back in the line of succession. She thought that with her father gone and her sister in power, things would change. But the truth was much harsher. Anne quickly requested the privileges due to her position, a palace and a large allowance from Parliament, but was flatly refused by William and Mary. They also blocked all attempts for her husband George to gain a position in the military. Anne realized what was happening. Despite being next in line, the current king and queen were doing everything they could to prevent her from having any influence. Throughout this turbulent period, Sarah Churchill was Anne's closest confidant. Their relationship was so deep that they used intimate names for each other. Anne was Mrs. Morley and Sarah was Mrs. Freeman. This implied equality, but did Sarah truly see Anne as an equal? Sources indicate that Sarah Churchill, in private, actually considered Anne a fool, finding her conversation terrible and extremely boring to be around. Sarah took full advantage of this relationship. By associating with Anne, she rose powerfully in society. William and Mary made her husband Duke of Marlborough, turning Sarah into a powerful duchess. But then, William and Mary realized the alarming level of influence Sarah had over Anne. Queen Mary demanded that Anne dismiss Sarah. When Anne refused, Mary took an extremely cruel action. She forced Sarah Churchill to leave the royal residence, disbanded Anne's Guard of Honor, forbade courtiers from visiting her, and required government officials to ignore everything she said. By this point, the two sisters hated each other almost as much as they hated their father. Queen Mary's cruelty did not stop there. Soon after Sarah was forced to leave the palace, Anne gave birth to another son, and the baby also died just minutes after birth. While Anne was immersed in that deepest grief, her sister Queen Mary came to visit. But if Anne thought it was a visit to offer condolences, she was mistaken. Mary did not come to mourn her lost nephew. Instead, she took advantage of the opportunity to scold Anne about her friendship with Sarah Churchill. Imagine the scene. A mother is grieving the death of her newborn, and her sister, the Queen, stands over her, shouting about politics and friendships. For Anne, lying there, her heart broken from losing her child, having her sister scream at her about her closest friend was the final straw. It was an explosion of accumulated pain and anger. After Mary left that day, the two sisters never saw each other again. A blood relation was permanently severed by cruelty and power. Ironically, just a few years after that final confrontation, smallpox, the disease that had previously claimed Anne's two infant daughters, struck Queen Mary. After a short and fierce battle, Mary died in 1694. Anne was now the obvious heir. But tragedy did not release Anne. She was never truly healthy, and her gout worsened significantly. By this point, the disease tormented her so much that she was almost unable to walk and had to rely on servants to push her in a wheelchair. Imagine the future queen about to hold the fate of a nation, yet imprisoned within her own body. The declining health led to significant physical changes. Anne was constantly in pain, and she no longer cared about her clothes. Her dresses were often dirty and tattered. Her legs, where the gout was most severe, were almost always terribly bandaged. Her face became red and blotchy. Her old friend, Sarah Churchill, who had once been close to her, later coldly described Anne as having become extremely fat and gross. Once again, the hypothesis of Hughes syndrome or an autoimmune disease appears to explain not only the pregnancy tragedies, but also the other painful symptoms she suffered throughout her life. This condition may have contributed directly to her declining health and her need for a wheelchair later. By 1700, Anne had endured a horrific period of motherhood, but the worst pain, the most terrible loss, had yet to come. In July 1700, just months after her 12th stillbirth, her only surviving son was taken at the age of 11. Prince William, her eldest son, the holder of all hopes for a stable future for the dynasty. After nearly 20 years of trying to have children, and now the last child was gone. That was an extreme point of personal tragedy. Historians write that the boy's death left Anne and her husband plunged into indescribable grief. A year later, Anne's father, the former King James, also died. Immediately, Anne's stepmother, Mary of Modena, sent her a surprising letter. In it, she begged Anne to restore her father's lineage and put her son on the throne after William's death. It's hard to believe that even in that moment, the political struggle continued, trying to exploit Anne's pain and position. And then finally, the historical moment arrived. In 1702, King William died, and Anne finally ascended to the throne. The English people were overjoyed. They preferred William to the Catholic James, but William was still Dutch. With Anne, they finally had a legitimate Anglican monarch, born and raised in England. She was the first married queen to reign alone in English history. But Anne's coronation was not a scene of complete glory. Severely afflicted by gout, she could not walk to Westminster Abbey. Instead, she had to rely on servants to carry her on a special sedan chair to the church. This was a haunting contrast, the ultimate glory of the throne juxtaposed with physical pain and human fragility. Under Queen Anne's reign, a monumental historical event took place. In 1707, England and Scotland officially united to form Great Britain, making her the first queen of this new nation. This was an incredible achievement. At the same time, Sarah Churchill returned, expecting to continue having great influence. However, a new figure appeared. Abigail Hill, Sarah's poor cousin, who had been helped by Sarah and became a lady-in-waiting in Anne's palace. Anne quickly found in Abigail kindness, gentleness, and compassion, things that Sarah, who had become harsh and domineering, lacked. The close relationship between Anne and Abigail deepened, and Anne began to shift her affection to the younger lady-in-waiting. Sarah, busy with her new status, did not realize this change until it was too late. When Anne openly rewarded Abigail generously, Sarah felt personally betrayed. In anger and jealousy, Sarah took an extreme action for revenge. She hired a writer to produce a highly scandalous poem implying that Anne and Abigail had a lesbian relationship. Not stopping there, she sent Anne a letter containing excerpts from the poem, accompanied by a blunt threat. "Such things are within my power. If known, they can cost you your crown." Ultimately, Sarah's cruelty and threats led Anne, who had already suffered so much, to decide she had had enough. She formally requested Sarah's resignation from her offices and appointed Abigail to the closest position. Sarah Churchill, the second most powerful woman in the country, lost all her influence, marking the end of the complex and dramatic relationship between these two women. Anne's health, already weak throughout her life, deteriorated irreversibly after the final conflict with Sarah Churchill. By March 1714, she seemed close to death. After months of being confined to bed, Anne suffered a stroke on July 30th, and this time there was no recovery. She died on August 1st, 1714. Her doctor, John Arbuthnot, could not help but see her end as a release. She had lived in pain for many years. He wrote, "I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveller than death was to her. Anne's physical condition at the end of her life was remarkable. She had become severely obese and was almost unable to move. According to reports, her coffin was so large that it required 14 men to carry it. A haunting detail showing the extent of her decline. With no living direct heir, the question of who would ascend the throne after Anne became urgent. Parliament had passed the Act of Settlement, a law that still affects the rules of succession in Britain today. The core provisions included no Catholic could ascend the throne, only legitimate children were eligible, and preference was given to the eldest son. Anne's closest Protestant relative was Sophia of Hanover. Although over 80 years old, she was determined to outlive the ailing 49-year-old Anne to claim the throne. She almost succeeded, but a letter from Anne accusing Sophia of plotting to seize the throne shocked her so much that she died 2 months before Anne. Finally, the throne went to Sophia's son, George I, opening a new era of the Hanoverian dynasty in England. In her memoirs, her old friend and later enemy Sarah Churchill made a bitter remark, essentially calling Anne a totally foolish queen who would have achieved nothing without her. But Sarah Churchill was known for looking down on others. Perhaps Sarah Churchill was wrong. It turns out Queen Anne was a boss in a way. Could a woman who endured so much loss and pain like Queen Anne truly be considered great? Or did those terrible challenges forge and shape one of the most important monarchs in British history? Share your thoughts in the comments section below.